I made some pretty good progress today after coming home from work and diving straight into this. So both bearings are on. This top bearing pressed in very nice right here. I'm bottomed out. No type of damage or anything to the bearings. As I stated when I was videotaping, you want to definitely press on the sleeve itself. You do not want to press on this cage. This cage is thin metal and you can easily damage it. And if you damage it, these roller bearings are not going to rotate freely, and you can then damage the race on the inside of this bell housing or this part of the transmission case itself. So next, what I want to do is research the torque of these and possibly with using Loctite. Now, of course, I would put a teeny bit of lubrication on here just so the serrated edges can kind of slip into place and lock themselves in, but I would like to consider using Loctite to hold this into position. A lot of cars, we don't have much information with cars, or there's not much on the internet with a lot of the Volkswagen and Audi cars with transverse engines and a Wavetrac and launching really hard with 1300 horsepower and above, if they've ever had any type of problems with these bolts coming loose. Anytime you're exceeding 1,000 horsepower, a lot of times I've found in many applications they're using Loctite on the bolts. Under the factory torque specs and under normal factory horsepower, you're not going to be causing a lot of shock to where these bolts will back out. But once you start hitting triple digits and above, high triple digits and above, jump into that 1,000 plus horsepower range, hitting 13, 14, 1500 horsepower, we don't have many people that can give documentation on whether they've had issues with these or not. A lot of times we've had people switch to an inline application, changing from their transverse to an inline and a whole completely different drivetrain setup. But with the Wavetrac and a transverse application and using the hard X for the rear wheels, we want to make sure that all of this is secure and we can put as much horsepower as this transmission will allow before we start shearing the gears apart. Our next thing that we will have to research is getting a whole completely new upgraded gear kit that can maintain a horsepower of pushing 13, 14, 1500 plus horsepower. I just cleaned all the bolts with brake cleaner or carb cleaner, and now I'm cleaning each one of the bolt holes out so that way once I put a little Loctite on them, I don't have oil inside the hose, and that prevents the Loctite from adhering properly. 2:48 a.m. before I go to work today. I have all of the bolts taken back out of the diff, cleaned all the bolts up with carb cleaner, as well as cleaned the bolt holes up. So today I'll put some Loctite on each one of the bolts and torque it down to spec. I also ordered a seal kit for the transmission, so that way once I get everything back up, if I need some extra seals, I'll have them ready and available to install them inside the case. And today, after I get this torqued up, I'll put this back into the transmission case. Just put Loctite on each one of the bolts and snug each bolt down according to the chart where you would want to install the bolts in like a cross pattern, and snug everything up. About to take everything downstairs, put it into the vise, secure it, and torque all the bolts down to 74 foot-pounds of torque. I'm cleaning the transmission casting off, getting all the old sealant from around the case housing, and I'm preparing to install the differential next. And then after I do that, then I have to clean the other half of the casing because it's been machined with an R32 or VR6 pretty much adapter plate that will adapt this Dq500 transmission to the VR6 engine. I have both of the transmission halves cleaned up, and I have two scrapers which I use to get rid of the silicone sealant that was around the edge of the transmission. I have a plastic one so that way you don't gouge or do any damage to the transmission casing, because these you do not want to nick or put any type of dings or cuts in here. You want this to be nice and smooth all the way around the perimeter, so that way when you put your sealant around it, it'll bond nice and good without any type of gouges, and you don't want to create any type of seepage or leakage. And I did the same thing for this one as well. So now I'll install these two halves together, prep to install my transmission oil tubes, and then possibly pick up with the Mechatronic units tomorrow. I'm having a stage 2 set of pistons for our race engines that's a little more extreme than our original batch. Our original batch can be run on the street using pump gas or E85. Now my second stage of pistons, these are pretty much going to be used race only. So I'm going a little more extreme with these, and as a result, the manufacturer requested that we perform and send in some combustion chamber molds. So right now I have this cylinder head level, and I cleaned up 2 of the combustion chambers because they want one for the front bank and one for the rear bank. This will be the front cylinders 2, 4, and 6, and 1, 3, and 5 for the rear. Have the head balanced, and I'm going to pour a mold in here, but before I do that, I'm going to spray a release agent in both of these combustion chambers here and here, and as a result, pour that mold and see how everything turns out after everything dries up overnight. Pour the resin into the combustion chambers, and I'm gonna let it sit overnight, and we'll see how it turns out tomorrow morning. You can see the bubbles starting to rise up as the resin is drying up. My cylinder head mold turned out pretty good. It's getting hard, and it didn't take long. So this is the cup that I use to pour my epoxy in it, and as you can see, it turned out pretty good, and it formed perfectly to the shape of this cup, and that's what I want for this combustion chamber right here. The epoxy turned out pretty good, but I want to do something different. It's better to have the mold simulating the cylinder diameter also. So I'm going to stack something up on top of here, and I want to pour second mold over top of this, at least I would say 1/2 inch higher than this original mold right here, this epoxy mold. And as a result, that will simulate the cylinder itself and how the combustion chamber forms over top of the piston. That way, when I get my custom piston made, they'll have a better reference on how to design my newer pistons for my stage 2 application. Preparing to pour my second mold, I have the cylinder head balanced. I'm going to install some caps over top of each one of the original molds and drill down into each one, so that way when I pour my second mold over top of the original, it will bite down and sink inside the original casting pretty good. And that way, once I press it out of the head, I don't have to worry about the second casting breaking off. Preparing to pour the molds now for my second stage. I drilled holes into the original casting that I poured, and of course I did not want to use my brand new piston ring tool but it worked out great because it highlights the diameter of the bore, and it would allow me to simulate a piston perfectly for the dimensions of my bore size. So I took one for the team. Of course, I just had to clean it up good, but I didn't want to do it. Okay, I'm going to take these piston ring compressor tools down to the cylinder head. I put a little silicone around it to keep the second casting from leaking out, but these worked out pretty good because all around you can see that it simulates the bore, and I'm going to pour that second stage in. I also drilled holes in it so that way the epoxy can kind of sink down into the pores and help it stay bonded together to the first piece. Poured my second casting over top of the original, and the bubbles are rising to the top as the epoxy is self-leveling. So I'll let this cure overnight, pop it out tomorrow, inspect it, and send it to the manufacturer so that they can continue with my piston design. Now the casting turned out pretty good. The sleeves formed a nice cylinder shape around it, and I was able to pull it off. I used silicone around it to keep everything in position. Now the next challenge is getting these from off the cylinder head and taking a look to see how everything turned out. I removed the exhaust cam so that way I can try to use the valves to push out the molds that I casted into the combustion chambers. So I'm going to rotate the intake camshaft around, and as you can see, it's slowly peeling and pushing the mold out. Now I have this blanket underneath, tarp, because I don't want it to crack or anything if it falls. But it's really a pretty hard epoxy. But after all my hard work and labor, why take a chance? Okay, it pushed it out. Now the next challenge would be to get it unseated from the intake valve. That's great. So the mold appears to be in there and casted very well. Now I'm going to just slowly use a piece of wood that I have here, some shims, and I'll try to pry it out without cracking or damaging the casting. I don't know if I want to take a chance doing this on video. No, thank you. I will just use both hands, set down the phone, and show the after effect. It's turned out great. I just had to use a flat tip screwdriver and pry just a little bit, and it just popped right off of the valves. So this looked pretty good. You can actually see where the epoxy itself started to penetrate the cylinder bore. But what I did was use a rubber plug and measured how far the spark plug protrudes into the combustion chamber, and I used a rubber plug in these two cylinders and measured it at the same distance that this protrudes, and that way it has a nice shape in there, and that way they can cast the racing pistons for the fill bowl in a proper location. I have the castings out and they turned out great. I immediately marked the first bank of pistons because you do not want to get these mixed up. It is very crucial that you follow proper casting procedures, and you really want a good cast. And the reason for that is this direct injected cylinder head, the cylinders, the combustion chambers in the cylinders are shaped differently. They are not exactly the same. So for example, you can see where the direct injector goes is more on a different angle, spray and fill into the combustion chamber. You can see the difference in the extra clench right here. Over here is more of a V groove right in here, as well as your intake valves sit on a different angle. So these valves right here are angled more, and they're almost even with the deck of the cylinder head. And over here, and this is the rear banks, cylinders 1, 3, and 5. 2, 4, and 6, the intake valves sit more with a recess, and you can see right here the configuration of how these are seated more further inside the combustion chamber. And your exhaust valves are on an angle and it's a little bit closer to the deck height of the cylinder head. So it's extremely important. But the casting turned out great. I'll label these as well. You can see the configuration for my direct injectors. Once I wipe it up, it'll look a lot better. That's the spray lubrication I use as a release agent so that this mold did not become a part of the cylinder head and become seized or stuck in there. So you definitely want to make sure you have a release agent to spray to help this pop out of place. And as you can see, I mean, it conformed very great. You can see the valves, all the casting material, and how everything turned out. So this turned out great, as well as the direct injector itself that would be right here on the front part of this mold. And here, if I flip this over, don't want to mess the paint up, get a little extra chance to dry. You can see the difference right here between the two as far as the spray pattern of the direct injectors. Turned out great. I'm pleased with the molds that I casted over the weekend, and they turned out very great. I am very, very pleased with the way they turned out. So, for example, I'll mark these 1, 3, and 5. This would happen to be the rear bank. And as you can just see, the way the direct injector is on an angle, it points more downward as it's pointing towards the combustion chamber. Hence, you can see the difference right here and the fill bowl. And on 2, 4, and 6, which you can see right here, this particular combustion chamber is on the front side of the engine, and you can see that there's a difference in the position of the fill bowl, as well as in contrast to 1, 3, and 5, the intake valves right here. So they have deeper valve reliefs for the intakes right here, versus the intakes aren't on such a steep angle on this front bank of cylinders right here. So this turned out great. So therefore, when I send these in, they'll be able to use this as a reference to design our race version piston, which is our second version. So we're starting off very great. He got back to me pretty quick this time, and we can really try to get a jump on the next engine build that we're setting up for our stage 2 and backup engines. So it's a little too late for me to make it to the post office, because as it states, they're closed. So they close in 1 minute. I can't make it down there. I'm gonna have to drop these up on Monday, and I'll package them up. Unfortunately, over the weekend, I had to take a slight pause from this bad boy right here, but the assembly is going very great. I have the oil pump in already, which is here. This is the oil pump filter. So I cleaned all the base surfaces up, so that way I can mount these two pieces together, and I'll make sure all the ports and everything is also cleaned up, and make preparation for my oil tubes, which would go into this part of the casing right here, for the oil pump, and as well as these valve body tubes as well. So this is coming along fairly well. Had I not had to work on this, I would have been finished with a great deal of the assembly with the transmission. Another good thing, our seals did come in for our transmission case, so I do have to order a couple extra seals. I have to order the seals for here, our differential seals. So that would be here, and on the other side of here, the diff seal, and I actually stuck that diff seal right here. I do not want to take a chance of having any type of oil leakage from this on the racetrack, so I definitely want to replace the seals in here, make sure everything is good and solid with no leakage.